last panel of the conference. I do hope during some of the breaks you have gone over to the expo booths. I actually spent the breaks this morning looking at them, and there's some really incredible videos there. How mushrooms grow is incredible. I've learned a lot about that. So I really do encourage you to stop over in those booths. They're really educational and a great opportunity to connect to the innovators in this space. So throughout this conference, we've heard a lot about the challenges facing the next-gen materials industry, and we've also heard a lot about its potential to solve major world problems. Innovation through the markets is a great way to get us there, but we have a long way to go, and right now, the choice to move into next-gen materials is voluntary. Many believe that the industry is not moving quickly enough, and we can never trust an industry to self-regulate. Governments are stepping in to offer guidance and impose new regulations on the industry. Some examples include the New York Fashion Act, the EU discussion on strategies for sustainable and circular textiles, the UK Competition and Markets Authority, the Netherlands Authority for Consumers in the Market. Both of those are setting guidelines to combat greenwashing. And there's calls in the US and the Federal Trade Commission to review its green guides. They outline rules against greenwashing and haven't actually been updated since 2012. Those are just a few I know about, and I'm sure we'll hear about more from the panelists. And I think we're going to see even more of these types of regulations in the future. So in this panel, we're going to discuss the benefits and the limitations of these types of initiatives and what else governments can do to combat greenwashing and support the development and adoption of more sustainable products and business practices. So I'm really excited to bring to the stage all of our panelists. So we have Christine Goulay, who's the founder of Sustainabelle Advisory Services, Nate Herman, the Senior Vice President of Policy for the American Apparel and Footwear Association, Barry McGeough, the Global Vice President of Product and Digital Innovation, and Michael Colarossi, the Vice President of Product Line Management, Innovation, and Sustainability at Avery Dennison. Thank you all so much for joining. So I'm going to go through call on each of you, and if you don't mind just giving us a few sentences, few minutes about your background in the fashion industry and specifically any experience you have in legislation. Let me go to Christine first.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks, MII, for the invitation to be part of this conversation. So I've been working in sustainability since 2006, mostly focused on sustainable fashion. I've worked in a couple of startups, Eden Apparel, and more recently Pangaea. And I've also worked in the large luxury group Kering in the sustainability department. And now I have my own advisory services for about a year. But I think what's most relevant to our conversation today is that I'm a lawyer, a recovering lawyer, I say, because I've been trying to get away from it, but I can't. And so now with all the legislation coming, I'm often asked about it. And so I have been trying to follow the massive amounts of legislation that are coming down the pike. And I did recently work on a project with the GIZ in Germany that was commissioned by the EU around legislation for traceability in the textile sector. So that was something I did recently in January and February, which was great in terms of talking with different stakeholders and getting their perspective. So I hope to bring that to the conversation today. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yes, I completely understand the recovering lawyer part. So am I. You can't ever get away from it. We need to somehow take that off our resumes so people don't ask. Barry, let me pass it over to you. Sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry. So, thanks for the opportunity to be here tonight, Nicole. And Christine, I can totally resonate. You said I'm a former lawyer, a recovering lawyer. One of the things I like to say is I'm a recovering product person. So I've been in the outdoor product industry for a long time. But got into the outdoor industry for outdoor brands like companies like the North Face and Deckers Outdoors. I am an innovation practitioner. senior executive working on innovation for brands in the product space. Most recently, I've spent the last few years at Wolverine, and what we've done is we've built two halves of our innovation house, which I think is germane to the conversation tonight. On the one half, we think about the stuff that goes on shoes, is what we kind of affectionately call it. Stephanie Domagen and I, and I hope she maybe is on the call, works really hard on the Wolverine side. We have developed over 50 new materials that the brands have wanted to adopt. About 95% of those materials are sustainable. So many of the people in the conference today, in the last couple of days, I've had the great good fortune of working with, helping to incubate and accelerate and really believe in the material side. And on the other side is the digital part of our house. The digital part of our house really looks at what is the consumer experience through the lens of new technology that's coming through, UI, UX. And so we're taking a really close look at things like technology triggers and stuff we'll talk about today, and understand what that means to the end consumer as well. So sustainability in two areas, materials development and on the digital side. And looking forward to the conversation this evening. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Barry. All right, Nate, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you again I'll echo everyone else. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I work for the American Apparel and Footwear Association. We are a traditional industry trade association that represents footwear and apparel brands and retailers, as well as suppliers to the industry. We represent over 1,000 named brands, mostly US, but other brands around the world as well. I am the Senior Vice President for Policy for the organization, and I've been with the organization almost 22 years now and have focused on sustainability and social responsibility during that time. I will trump everyone here because I am a currently practicing registered lobbyist, because a large part of my role is advocating on behalf of the industry and dealing with all the legislation and regulations that we'll be touching on today and have been touched on throughout the conference. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Mike.
Great. Thank you, Nate. You haven't escaped. So Mike.
Yeah, so we have two recovering lawyers, a recovering product person, a practicing lobbyist, and a failed engineer is what I like to refer to myself. And there's some sort of bar joke around that. We'll have to think about that at some point later. Yeah, so I am an engineer by training, chemical engineer. I actually spent most of my career thus far in the chemical industry. So about 15 years in the chemical industry and now about 10 in the apparel and textile industry. I work for Avery Dennison, and many of you probably know us as a labeling company. We're actually a larger material science company, and we believe that there is an opportunity in apparel around the intersection of physical and digital. So my role in the organization right now is around trying to figure out, from an innovation and product perspective, how do we enable some very interesting use cases as it relates to transparency, as it relates to sustainability at this intersection of physical and digital. So very much related to what Barry was saying. Avery Dennison on the policy side and regulatory side, very much engaged right now with the American Apparel and Footwear Association on the efforts in the United States around regulation, and then also in the EU, where we are engaged directly with the EU Parliament, but also organizations like Surpass, where we are looking to understand how some upcoming regulation is going to impact the industry, and attempting to lobby and ensure the regulation is both common sense and practical for industry to adopt. So looking forward to the conversation, and I promise I'll figure out this joke at some point in the near future.
Thank you so much, Mike. Well, and that's what I really like about this conference is, I mean, we are bringing in all the different perspectives, which I think is necessary to make sure that this industry survives, right? You're going to need the lawyers, the business aspect, and the technical expertise. So that's why I really appreciate the backgrounds of everyone on this panel. So Mike, I think you sort of set us up nicely. Why don't we start talking with the EU legislation? So for anyone who doesn't know, the EU's recently laid out its strategy for sustainable and circular textiles. It's part of the European Green Deal. This was laid out about a year ago, but still these things take a really long time and the details aren't clear. But the overarching ambition is that by 2030, all textile products entering the EU market will be durable and recyclable, free of hazardous substances, and produced with respect for both people and the planet. So this is pretty broad. So why don't we start with everyone's thoughts on this legislation? When do you think it's going to come to market? What are some limitations? What are some positive impacts? Would anybody like to start?
I can start. I'd love for other panelists to jump in. We were just with the EU about 2 or 3 months ago, and as an American, one thing jumped out at me very strongly is that the regulation is going to happen. While in the US, oftentimes we wait for political change or party change to determine the direction of regulation, the European system is very different. And so the regulation is going to happen. What it looks like, Nicole, to your point, the breadth and the specific detail may vary, but it was very clear to us coming away from those conversations that the industry needs to prepare now for this to actually occur. I will tell you that while there is commitment within the EU, there is still huge opportunity for the industry to provide expertise into the specific how you go about doing this. A lot of the regulators don't necessarily have the familiarity with the specific processes that we're engaged with, and there's opportunities to certainly have that conversation and ensure that the regulation or regulations are pragmatic in terms of adoption, but also content.
Mike, can I ask you a question? In your experience there, did you feel that American businesses are aware of this inevitability? I'm leading the witness, but I'm going to just ask the question anyways.
No. I think a lot of organizations are aware of something happening. What I see in general right now is a wait and see approach. And we are certainly working with our brand customers and advising that the wait and see approach means you're going to have to speed up very quickly because the regulation is coming. Now is the time to start preparing when you think about your design processes, when you think about your material selection choices, when you think about how and where your data comes from to be able to show transparency or to demonstrate that your products meet these requirements as how they're defined. That's not something that's going to happen, in a 2-month period. That's something that's going to take months, if not years, to build.
And that's my worry. What I do is I represent the brand side. We're the pull mechanism for what's happening on the demand side for the sustainable materials and the adoption of new ideas. And innovation is the way that those ideas get into a business. They're introduced, they're piloted, and they're adopted. I find it's really, really difficult to talk about these kinds of things that are legislative in nature or be mandated, because I do feel that our industry does take a wait and see attitude toward almost everything. And this one I think is a little bit more pressing. There will be a kind of what I would call a holy crap moment, right? Where people are going to say, oh my gosh, I have to be in compliance in such a short period of time. So I'm really be curious what everybody in this panel thinks about how the best way is to communicate something this serious that doesn't make us sound like we're the Cassandras, that we're just crying wolf, where every time we're saying that something crazy is going to happen. But this feels like it has teeth, and the inevitability that you mentioned earlier, Mike. How do we get our brands to pay attention? From your point of view, I'd be so fascinated to know your opinion.
Yeah, I want to open up to the panel because I think my opinion is only one. Yeah, I would just add, Barry. There's a couple of other things for everyone to consider here, because a lot of the focus is on brands and what is the consumer going to see. There is a massive need on the supply chain side. So most of those products that are sold in Europe are not manufactured in Europe. So brands need to think about their supply chain as well, and going back into South Asia, Southeast Asia, China, Vietnam, and thinking about how are those factories going to actually cope with this legislation, because they're the ones who are actually influencing a lot of that information and content. And that's not a conversation that we're necessarily having right now, but one that is going to be a tremendous need.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it does seem, I mean, as far as I understand with the regulations, it is all textiles entering the EU market. So exactly like you said, everyone does need to pay attention if your supply chains are outside of the EU. Christine, it looked like you might have something to add.
Yeah, I do. Thanks. I have a few things that I've been hearing from my conversations with brands and through the stakeholder consultations I've done, as I mentioned, with many different expert organizations. And I think one thing that's come up is the textile market has basically never really been regulated, completely under-regulated. And if you look at other sectors like the built environment or transport or food, there are health and safety reasons, which means they've been looking at traceability in a way that's not sort of a voluntary mechanisms that are in place, but legislative, mandatory reasons why they've been focusing on some of these issues before fashion. So I think that adds, Barry, to what you were saying, that brands don't understand the extent of what this really means for them, the resources that they're going to need to put into this, the human capital to be able to work on these issues of data, collecting data, having the traceability, et cetera. So I think that's one of the things that gives fashion a bit of a handicap at this point in time, is this lack of precedent of having to produce this information. I think a second thing that's quite complicated right now is because the regulations are not very clear, preparing for it is really difficult because they don't know exactly what is the data we should be focusing on collecting. It's not defined yet. So that is really frustrating, I think, to suppliers and brands alike who are saying, okay, we want to get moving, but what exactly should we be doing? Where should we be prioritizing? Because there's a lot of fuzziness as, these working groups are trying to get clarity and trying to come to more final directives and proposals.
Thank you. Well, Nate, I know you have a little bit less experience with Europe. If you have anything to add on Europe, or if you could also help talk to us about some of the U.S. regulations that are in the works.
I probably disagree with Christine that the industry has not been regulated. We've been regulated in the product safety space for decades now, and a lot of different at the state level, at the national level, and also internationally. And so we do have a lot of experience with that. The difference with when you're talking about sustainability and circularity and climate is that when you talk about product safety, it's banning or restricting a chemical. It's not easy, but you can focus on how do you replace that chemical or fix that problem, where circularity, sustainability, climate, so on and so forth is much broader. And in many cases, much more nebulous. And so it makes it much more difficult. And that's the difference. But we have been trying to convince our members about the need to engage on this now versus waiting, because of the idea that, as everyone has said, this regulation is coming. And regulation can be helpful if it's done the right way, but it only can be done the right way as if we provide the input on what is practical, enforceable, effective. And so to quote my boss, basically, we want to be at the table, not on the table when it comes to regulation. And that's critical for making sure the regulation is done effectively. And so, we're talking about 2030 in Europe, but a lot of other European regulations going to come online before that. We have the European Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which gets to the people part you're talking about, Nicole, but it's talking about the environmental impact of your supply chain all the way back to the raw material, talking about the social impact of your supply chain all the way back to the raw material. You have the digital product passport, which Mike and I have been talking about a lot, because that also gets to digital labeling and the need to move to digital labeling and get rid of these long labels, which also has a sustainability impact as well. But the need to, all this information that you're going to have to provide to Europe is essentially going to require you to have that information. You have to start collecting that now. And so something that underlies all this is the need for traceability and transparency in your supply chains. You need to have full visibility up to your raw material throughout all of your supply chains. And then you need to start measuring certain things, such as your carbon emissions, your water, wastewater, your water input, your ability to deal with product at the end of life and be able to create that circularity that you need. And so that's all needs to be happening now. But we haven't been able to convince everyone that they need to be focused on that now. There are drivers here in the United States on the social side, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, that force people to start looking at their supply chains and have that traceability and transparency. But what we haven't been able to convince so far, except for some, is that they need this across the board, because all this regulation is coming, and particularly on the sustainability side, it's coming very quickly. Just to turn quickly to the United States, we have not seen a whole lot of action at the federal level in the United States. There is a proposal from the Securities and Exchange Commission on climate reporting. That proposal, we're waiting for the final rule to be issued by the Securities and Exchange Commission. They keep delaying the publication of that rule. And there's a lot of feeling that as soon as the rule is published, it'll be held up in the courts by hundreds of lawsuits. And so it's likely not to move. And so you have, Nicole, what you mentioned earlier about the green guides and the Federal Trade Commission moving forward on redefining green labels. And we've been an active participant in that process, but we'll have to see where that goes and how fast that will move. Because the lack of information in that space has created a lot of consternation in the industry, and led to what a lot of people have talked about, green hushing, where people don't want to make any environmental claims because they don't know what will stand up in law because of what's happened in Norway and the UK, lawsuits here in the United States. A lot of people are worried about that. But we are seeing a lot of activity at the state level in the United States. The main focus was on the New York Fashion Act. New York Fashion Act has laudable goals, but tries to do everything everywhere all at once, and also only focuses on the fashion industry. People think maybe that's where it should be, but we're not the only industry that needs to be more sustainable right now. That legislation will not likely move this year. The New York legislature has adjourned for the year, but we will likely see that pop up again in New York and possibly in other states next year. What has happened is it has created the conversation, and the important conversation to talk about what the industry should be doing and how regulation should play a role in what the industry should be doing across the board. So, for example, we've been in conversations with the California legislature on a climate reporting bill that will likely move this year, will likely move probably by September. And in the United States, once California does something, the rest of the country has to follow suit. And that is a key part of the New York Fashion Act. And the way California has approached it is they're doing it in a way that makes sense, that's effective, that's enforceable, that the industry can do. And so we've been working with the legislators there. And so hopefully what the final bill will be something that the industry can support and will, again, move the ball forward. We are seeing efforts in California as well on extended producer responsibility. They have a fashion-specific extended producer responsibility legislation that could move this year. There are a lot of questions that are raised by it because of other things that California has done. What do you do with textiles that contain chemicals that are now banned in California, such as PFAS? How do you recycle those? Who's responsible for recycling counterfeit textiles that get into the supply chain? How about textiles that are bought directly from overseas e-commerce sites? Who's responsible for that? Is there really capacity to do textile recycling at the volume that you would have in the state of California? So there's a lot of questions around that, but that's something else that's moving forward that was envisioned in the New York Fashion Act. And we're working with the legislators to try and create something that works and that is effective. I know I've taken a lot of time here, so I'll stop filibustering and turn it over to someone else to talk.
Nate, and I'm curious, Nate, Christine, Barry, if you're a brand and you're selling into the United States, all these different states, and the EU, and in Asia, how are you addressing the fact that the EU is going to have a set of regulations that may be similar but slightly different than the US, maybe slightly different than other parts? If you're sitting as a brand, how do you navigate that?
So what Nate said is true. I think, as California goes, so goes the world. You could say as Europe goes, so goes the world. The toughest legislation, just like RSL, the toughest legislation will be the law of the land. It's really similar to US CAFE standards for gas consumption and fuel efficiency. Whatever one starts to have the teeth are the one will become the lowest common denominator for the brands to adopt, and they'll just try to take one standard. And to me, that really is the really important part, whatever that trigger is, because then brands that we support will do as little as they can until they have to, and then they'll try to do one thing because they are producing overseas for multiple markets. So you're not going to have a California product line and a New York product line. It's not going to happen. So that's the question comes, which is what we're talking about right now, is what is the definition? What is the enforceability? Which rule has teeth? Which one will brands have to adopt? And that's the one that they're going to scramble to get behind as quickly as possible.
And maybe to add, I agree with what Barry said. I would still push back on what you said, Nate, about the amount of legislation. I still think fashion compared to other sectors has very little legislation, but maybe we can talk about that at another point, the regulation around it compared to food. I mean, it's just, for me, it's night and day. But in any case, I think another thing that you're going to see, I'm actually living in a country, I live in France. So there's already a law, the AGEC law, which is requiring a label for traceability for companies that have at least 50 million in revenue and 15,000 products sold in France. They have to start being transparent about all the way up to their tier 2. Where is their product being made? What's the impact? What is the composition of everything? So it's happening here. And when I talk to brands, it's funny, some of them don't even know. And so they're not even compliant because they don't know. Others are just like, well, maybe we'll just pull our products from France. We don't know. We're not ready for that. So I think there will be potentially markets that brands will pull out of if it gets too difficult and they're not prepared for it. I do work with one thing I didn't mention in my intro, that in my work now at Sustainabelle, I'm working with a lot of innovators. So material science companies like natural fiber welding. And also I work with a traceability company called Fairly Made based here in Paris. And so they've done product level traceability and impact for a number of brands to be able to help them meet AGEC. And so all of the brands they work with are AGEC compliant, which is great. But now it's kind of a mad race to see in other countries as the legislation is becoming more clear, because member states are potentially going to have different rules here as well. How are brands going to address this? And I do know that, I have a friend working at a brand just saying, we're just trying to figure out what's applicable to whom, who has to worry about what. And it's like a puzzle for the moment.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point, Christine, is that the European Union, for whatever reason, has moved away from regulation to directives. And because of that, that means each of the 27 individual EU member states has to promulgate regulations to enforce whatever directive comes out, which means that you have 27 different interpretations, which is mimicking what we've already been dealing with increasingly in the United States, where individual states go ahead and do their own thing, and everybody's a little bit different. The reporting document's a little bit different. And that's one thing that our role is trying to say, well, you need to make this similar. So, for example, in the climate legislation in California, we're saying, well, if a report contains the information you want, if it's a report filed in France or elsewhere in Europe that has all the information, that should comply, that should make the company in compliance with the California law. So at least something is the same, that as long as you have contain the same information, that you can use whatever report to qualify. And that's been the role that we've been trying to play. But that is the biggest concern right now. Getting to what Barry has said is that we want one rule. And that's really why we want things to happen at the federal level, at the European-wide level, because otherwise trying to comply with 50 or 70 or 100 rules, it makes it next to impossible, all a slight bit different. It's a big waste of time and resources while not moving sustainability and moving the ball forward in any way. And that has been our role with relative degree of success in trying to get that done.
I think the Agile Club is a really great example of one that's out on the books, and actually how the industry is viewing it. Because I hear the same thing. We're working with brands on how do I comply with Agile law, and what we're saying is while this ecosystem of regulation is still very murky and very unclear, there are things that brands can be doing now to get ready for that, knowing that Agile is a great sort of first example of what may come. And it's about answering one of the questions in the chat. It's about digitizing your labeling now. May not replace the label just yet, but put a QR code on, put an RFID chip in, and put an NFC chip in. Start building your data platforms that sit behind it. Get yourselves ready for that. And then once we actually understand what the actual regulation is going to say, then you just have to build the application to actually enable that regulation. But there's nothing right now that's stopping brands from getting ready for what's going to come. And we're trying to work with AAFA, work with our brand customers, work with our factories to actually do that, to ensure that once we have final clarity on what these regulations are going to say, the infrastructure is already there to enable it, versus having a mad dash to get there.
So I'd like to play with that idea, run with that idea for a second. So looking at the case of RFID, just for inventory tracking and tracing, I can tell you that large organizations, even at a very, very low unit cost, were a solid, rational no on doing RFID unless they needed to do it. It was mandated by a Macy's or another retailer. So the interesting part is that hoping that they're going to want to adopt even a few more cents on cost of goods is going to be really difficult. However, we're reaching a really, really interesting technology inflection point, because at this moment you have all this regulatory stuff that we're talking about now, and these things which we mandated, which we don't know what's going to have teeth and what year it's going to be really effective and how quickly they have to react to it. But we also have this influx of new technology on the consumer side, where we actually have the opportunity to engage, and people are expecting more and more engagement with the product from a digital perspective. So the 5 things that the digital passport are basically put out to address are specifically access to product information, certificate of authenticity and ownership, product lifecycle management, CRM tools, and VR replicas of physical product. So if you think about the experiential layer, we have this idea, and this is the part that I get really excited about. Once a trigger is on a garment or a pair of footwear, then that trigger can be used for anything. So if it's put on for the idea of tracking and tracing, let's say, then what brands will do is say, well, it's already on there anyways. I'm already creating NFTs. I already have an NFC chip. And then I can create an experiential layer where I can have AR, VR on there and build in programs like loyalty on top of tracking and tracing. So brands that are starting to play around with it, especially the luxury brands, are looking at the ability to tag product and then throw in a whole bunch of AI and say that the technology providers that are offering this technology are coming at us thick and fast, and the AI is democratizing the cost of these things, right? So it's a really heady technological environment to say what will be the trigger here. Will the trigger be legislative push or end consumer pull, and the opportunity to scratch these other itches? Because look, the brands have a lot of itches to scratch. They're right now, everyone wanted to get to 50% e-commerce penetration, and then people are backing off of it saying, no, it's all about brick and mortar, it's all about wholesale. So, but they know that they need to be able to engage consumers, because engagement and time on site means conversion, and everybody wants to convert. That's the name of the game, right? So the idea of being able to add on an experiential layer, maybe even before the legislative part comes into play, could be it going around backwards, backing into the front door instead of walking through the front door head first. We don't know how it's going to happen. So I was at a factory yesterday. I'm in Vietnam, and a major footwear brand in the US, in the EU and global, is working on putting permanent QR codes, consumer-facing QR codes, on all their product now. They're doing it right now. And so they're looking at the experiential layer. Their QR codes are already on Nike right now. So they have a Nike QR system, and that's really around loyalty, getting deals, connect to consumer. So it may happen that these triggers are put onto product anyways, and then they will already be traceable, compliant. It's just the back-end systems that will manage that data will have to be built. But the triggers will already be there. So
Barry, you're hired.
I'm
fascinated here, Barry. But yeah, I mean that is the idea of digital labels. Is that Ralph Lauren is a great example here in the United States, where they have it on virtually all their clothing, and they've been driven by the customer experience and the customer engagement that they can get from that. It was originally done as an authenticity from a brand protection point of view, but they now are doing it because they're getting 13,000 hits a day on those QR codes on their garments, and they've been able to get return sales and a number of other customer engagement benefits from that. The concern with the digital labeling is that that's yet another label on your garment in addition to the book of labels that already exists. And the reason that book of labels exists is because there's a proliferation of regulation on what countries want for the garment manufacturer to share with the consumer. And that continues to grow. There's no harmonization of labeling requirements at all. It's gone the opposite direction. And more labeling more and more countries are requiring more and more information, a lot in the sustainability space, and that's a digital product passport in Europe and the French AJAC law and others, but we're seeing that expand well beyond that. And so the concern is that we need to change the laws in these countries, hopefully starting in the United States, but then moving to Europe and Canada and Japan, Australia, so on and so forth, where you can use these digital labels, such as a QR code, to replace the physical label. And so all you have in that garment or in that shoe or in that accessory is the QR code or some other digital format label. And then you can get all the information in that back system that Barry, you were describing, that Mike's company would be creating, that you can get all that information you get in the language that the consumer wants to get the language in, whatever their phone is set to, they'll get it in that language. They'll get it however for visually impaired. Accessibility will be dramatically increased because you can use text to voice. You can get it in your own language. You can put it at any font size that you want versus that little type on the labels. You don't have to worry about care symbols, nobody understanding care symbols. It solves a lot of problems, but also gives you a new platform to present new sustainability ideas to the consumer, share how you could recycle products, how you could reuse products, resell products, and hopefully extend the life of that garment or footwear well beyond what is being used today.
And I think, and I wasn't expecting this to be a labeling conversation, but thank you, everyone. Yeah, I think what's really interesting is I always say that the label is the only sort of communication device on our apparel, other than sort of any branding that's on it. What's interesting is we've discovered, and what we've found in our pilots is that while we're talking about transparency or consumer engagement, digitizing your label also has other very unique value proposition when it comes to things like enabling automated sortation for recycling. Now you're talking about taking costs out of a recycling system, making it more effective. We talk about enabling re-commerce, extending the life of garments, and it all links back to actually some of these additional regulatory hurdles that are going to be coming at organizations and how they're going to address it. And it's really interesting to see how, if we're able to digitize some of our garment labeling, whether it's with a QR code, an NFC, an RFID, that's all to be determined and often brand determined, it can unlock a whole set of additional value use cases that you weren't necessarily thinking of when you first started your journey. And it helps you comply with all these other regulations. So it's an interesting conversation. And I thank everyone for being advocates for digital labeling.
I think over the course of the process of getting into innovation, what I really find myself agitating for all the time is becoming more consumer centric, and the consumers are demanding and expecting a relationship with a brand. They're expecting you to know them without in a creepy way, but they want you to know them. They want you to be, they want to have a relationship with brands, and they want to have experiences. And all that is being driven by the digital. And so it is an inevitability, and it's super, super interesting to see the tiptoeing that we're doing as an industry versus other industries going full scale into it. So I'll give you a quick example. We last year had a collective spasm of interest and then total disinterest in something called the metaverse. Okay, we got excited about it, and then we said, it's for kids. What we're not remembering is the consumers are not just the consumers of the t-shirts and the shoes that we make. They're the consumers of everything. So the consumer that doesn't want to be in the metaverse to buy your t-shirt, so you think, might work in an Amazon warehouse that has a heads-up display that's working in the industrial metaverse every single day. They're in the metaverse. So we forget there's a medical metaverse, there's an industrial metaverse, and then that means that all the commercial metaverse is going to come. So we think about this stuff where we can tend to be in a bubble. So we have to understand that when we're looking at what technology is driving the consumer experience and everything they look at it every single day. And then we get to, as innovators, we get to shine a light on it and say, it's here and it's coming to a neighborhood, coming to your neighborhood soon, right? And that's very, very much what we see.
Thank you all so much. You're making my job as a moderator extremely easy. I really appreciate this. I want to step back for a second, because I think most of the people who are watching this or participating in the conference are brands and material companies or investors who are invested in one or the other or both. And it sounds like the message is there are laws that exist right now that you might not be complying with or are aware of. You should look into that. And two, there are definitely laws coming and you need to be prepared. But even until then, consumers are demanding more information, more engagement, and want to know more about the products they're buying. I'd love to go to each of you, and if you have some advice for the industry on what they should be doing now, and as specific as you could get would be useful with those audiences in mind. So a lot of the material companies are going to be the main suppliers of the vast majority of the materials to these brands. They're also going to have to know their own supply chains, which honestly, knowing this industry is a lot easier. I mean, you've seen some of the presentations. A lot of the material companies are very aware are conducting life cycle analyses, do know their inputs. But they're going to have to supply that information to the brands too. What would you advise everyone to start doing right now? And Christine, I'll go to you first.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, this is an important question, Nicole. So I'm really glad you redirected our conversation here too. I think there's an opportunity for everybody here to look at the complete life cycle of the product that we're making. One of the biggest hurdles to the adoption and scale of the next gen materials is the effect of the price, the COGS at COGS. Like you're buying a material and it's more expensive because it's made differently. And we get very hung up on that because we all know that we have to, brands have to run a business and they need a certain margin. But now with the legislation coming into play, when we're looking at the costs of compliance, the costs of getting data, the CSDD and the risks associated with human rights violations or other potential issues that you might have in high risk supply chains, and the EPR, extended producer responsibility types of compliance costs that come up as well. I think this is a great opportunity to really look at the product life cycle and the business case for adopting materials that will lessen the costs along this whole product life cycle and not just focusing on that first step when the COGS might be a little higher. So that would be my advice.
Oh, that's really interesting. Can I paraphrase, make sure I understand? So could it be that right now using existing supply chains might seem simpler and also easy, but in the long run, there's going to need to be a greater understanding of everything going on. And so brands, material companies, everyone should start paying attention now, and even some upfront costs could save costs in the long run.
Yeah. I can take an example of another company I'm working with. It's called Resortex, and Resortex does a dissolvable thread for disassembly. So they have an oven system, and instead of taking a product at the end of life and cutting around the zippers and Velcro and everything and losing all that material input and spending all the time and the manual labor needed for that, you can put the clothes through an oven at the sorter recycler and everything breaks apart. You recover 100% of the materials, and these materials can go back and be the inputs again for the brand. So at first, if you think, oh, well, maybe this thread is more expensive than the thread I'm buying, if that could be, is that a showstopper? Well, if you look at the life cycle of this product and garment, at the end of life, you're recuperating all of the materials that you can use again, and you're compliant with EPR, and you don't have to worry about, anything regarding traceability of new products because you're using the same ones, or the impact of new products. So this is what I'm trying to get across, is that when we're thinking of our budgets, being more holistic about what that budget is, less siloed and less focused on that first merchandising, like cost of goods buyer, this is too expensive right now to put on the market. And instead of passing along costs to the consumer and having a higher priced garment or product go out, which the consumer won't want because it's priced more highly than the other products they're used to or that they're used to from this brand, which gets us in perpetual capsule collection world, to take a broader view of what is going to be the benefit to our company if we're adopting one of these new technologies that can ensure the entire life cycle of this product. I hope that's clear.
That was an excellent example. Thank you. Okay. That really helped a lot. And I think that to me is that the purpose of a lot of these new regulations is right now the industry has been getting away with not paying for its own externalities, right? That basically at end of life and, the non-traceability, we're not paying for the environmental impact that the processes and materials have on the environment, and the traceability, the requirement of recycling, end of life, all of that is going to bring those externalities back into the fashion industry. And so you're going to be paying for it either at the beginning of life when you choose your materials, your threads, et cetera, else, or at the end of life. Did you want to add something, Christine?
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you for rephrasing that more clearly than I said it. But it's really about joining up those departments internally within a brand to make sure that that work is happening and not being siloed. Yeah.
Oh, that's a very good point too. Yeah, bringing everyone together internally. Mike, can I pass it over to you?
You can. I would say get engaged would be my recommendation. There are lots of resources out there for brands and for material providers. I know it's overwhelming, but get engaged with organizations like AAFA, where there is quite a bit of information and guidance to try to make this spaghetti plate of regulation a little bit easier to understand. And then once you've done that, then I think the next step is to figure out where you're going to, on the data side, that's where you're going to get your data, and start to prepare your systems to be able to capture that information. And that is not a small undertaking in any way, shape, or form. So my overarching mention is start now. Don't wait.
And this might be too complicated of a question, but I'd like to open it up. When we talk about data, I'm wondering for smaller companies that might hopefully don't feel too overwhelmed, but are sufficiently scared by what we're saying here. What data should they start to look at collecting? Is it really understanding the environmental impact? Do they need to be requesting LCAs from their supply chain? Is it the human rights impact? What should the companies start to collect?
So I'll get it started. I think one of the benefits of this industry is that we often share a lot of the same supply chain. So smaller organizations may actually benefit from the larger organizations and brands driving their supply base down this path. But certainly, I would start conversations within the supply chain now about environmental impact of the materials that they are selecting, and the materials that go into their product, and definitely social. And frankly, those are conversations that have been happening in the industry for a very long time. They should not be new. It's a matter of finding the platforms through which you want to collect and store that data and assign it to your physical product. And that's where this whole idea of digital ID product platform sort of comes into play. So that would be my response. I don't know if others have a response.
Thank you. And Nate, I'm assuming you have some good recommendations. Seeing that,
so I would agree with that. I mean, again, it all gets back to what you talked about at the beginning, Nicole, is the traceability and transparency in your supply chain. You need to know who those material suppliers are. You need to know where the raw materials that are going into the materials you're using are coming from. And then there gets to be the question of leverage, particularly for smaller firms when you go further up the supply chain. And Mike talked about, well, you can benefit from the large firms already asking for a lot of this information. But we've been trying to work with our members on how can they collaborate. And collaboration is sort of a dirty word in our industry. Nobody likes to work together and share, but that's critical when you're talking about understanding the environmental and human rights impact further up the supply chain, because leverage is, even for the biggest companies, is very limited once you get to the third or fourth tier of your supply chain. That you need to be able to work together and create third-party certifications that multiple companies can use at the same time, and try and figure out ways to collaborate on that information. But you can't do that unless you know who's in your supply chain. So it really gets back to that traceability and transparency in your supply chain. And many of the regulations coming online are going to require you to publicly share that information anyway, such as the European Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the New York Fashion Act, and others are going to require that transparency regardless. And so it's better that you be doing that now, because you're not going to be able to comply with any of these unless you have that visibility. But I did want to get to one other point that was raised by Mike, was the engagement. The engagement is critical for companies to get involved and be at the table when these regulations are being made, because there is a distinct lack of understanding from policymakers on how all the regulations that they're putting out there interact. For example, there's a lot of talk about using recycled cotton or regenerative cotton. The issue that it's next to impossible to know the source until things like Christine was talking about come into place. It's going to be very difficult to know the source of the recycled cotton. It's scraps from multiple factories in multiple countries. It's it could be charities, could be any number of sources. But under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, for example, you need to know the source of the cotton back to the virgin fiber. You can't do that with recycled cotton. So everybody's saying we should be using recycled cotton, but then UFLPA says, well, if you can't tell us the source of the virgin fiber, we're going to detain your shipment and not allow you to be able to sell that product in the United States. Another example in California, again, is they recently passed legislation banning PFAS chemicals in all apparel products starting in 2025. But then they're also working on this extended producer responsibility requirement, where they are going to require the industry to set up a system to recycle all textiles that are sold and consumed in California. If anything comes in that's pre-2025, that means it's going to likely contain PFAS, particularly certain types of products, performance outerwear, other things like that. How do you reconcile those two things? If you're essentially saying PFAS is a banned hazardous substance, but then you're saying we need to recycle all these clothes, which pre-2025 it was okay to have PFAS in them, how do you reconcile those two things? And that's why policymakers the brands need to engage so that policymakers understand that there's a cause and effect, and that what they do in one place is going to have a dramatic impact on what they try and do in another place.
Great. Thank you so much, Nate. Barry, any advice for industry?
Yeah, Nate, I'm really glad that you brought up the pre-competitive environment. I know that was a real big theme at the AAFA conference in March, and I was really glad to hear Steve Lamar talk about that, because I love the pre-competitive environment, and I do believe that all boats rise on the same tide when we work on not the things that we compete with each other on, but making industry decisions and driving that back to Christine's point. That's how you're going to drive down COGS, that's really, really important. So I was in a shoe factory the other day, and I heard a brand talking about how their shoes were handmade. And I watched the thousands of hands that touched one pair of shoes. And I thought, this is so funny, because every pair of shoes that's made is handmade. The reason why I say that is because we are an analog industry in a digital time. We're extremely analog. We think in analog ways. We think about analog supply chains. And frankly, the way our product is made is also very basic. The problem with that is that we live in a digital age, and that digital age is wildly accelerated by everything from legislation to technology and everything I talked about earlier around the consumer experience. So it's coming at us thick and fast. Like when the Galactic Cruiser came out of Alderaan and all the planet bits came at their heads, right? We don't know what to do with it. So my advice with that preamble is this: make sure that you have an innovation division that believes in return on investment innovation, like not pilots, but connect to the core business and figure out, when you're looking at all this stuff coming into your front windshield, you need someone to be able to help make sense of it and make decisions. And those decisions have to be based on risk, and also that can these days be made on opportunity. So I'm a really big fan of a woman called Rita McGrath. She wrote a book around discovery-driven planning. And basically the premise is this: start with small ideas and figure out what works for you. Don't try to change the enterprise. Don't eat the elephant in one bite. but try things that work and then do more of those things. But you have to pay attention. You can't bury your head in the sand. You're not going to go back and crank up the cotton gin, right? That's not going to happen, right? We are squarely in the 21st century, and everything that's coming at us is going to force us to change quickly. And the brands that are succeeding right now are the ones that are embracing digital technology, digital design. Everyone likes to talk about Shein, and all these companies that are looking at, they're leaning right in. Young companies, and you mentioned something about young companies. What do? I'm less worried about young companies because they understand data. I see startups all the time, and they're scrappy. They use every digital tool out there, and they love data, and they know what to do with it. It's the established companies that don't know what to do with the data. So you have to figure out a data solution, a technology solution, and a way to understand how this brings opportunity, because there is a tremendous amount of opportunity on the consumer engagement side that can be leaned into, that can actually help you make more money. And that's really what this is going to be all about, is making more money and keeping the money that you're making by being compliant. So that would be my advice to brands.
Thank you so much, Barry. And unfortunately, we're out of time. I really appreciate everyone joining us today and your willingness to share your expertise. A quick summary I'd love to give to the audience, in case you didn't quite get it, is these regulations are coming. So it really is important to start paying attention now. It will likely be a difficult, long process. If anyone has experience with data, you will know how hard and detailed it is, especially with really long supply chains. So start now. And this might be regulation driven, and also might be consumer driven. So I think the message that Barry and others have said is that there are brands who are leading the way in getting this information to consumers early, before regulations require them to. And consumers do want a lot of the information that industry is going to be required to provide. So why not even start early before the regulations are in place? So thank you all again. We are actually at the end of the conference. I can't believe the 3 days are over. So I did want to take this chance to actually bring my team up and thank everyone behind the scenes. There's been a lot of us who have been making this go smoothly. So here's the MII team. I would also love to do a quick little pitch for our services. If you have seen our booth, we do have one of the booths in the expo. We have a website. We are a nonprofit. We offer all of this, all of these resources like the Environmental Data Coalition, our reports, white space analysis, connecting material companies to brands, investors, all of this to the industry for free. And we are only able to do that because of philanthropy. So if you do believe in next-gen materials, getting them to market as quickly as possible, and our work in bringing everyone together and accelerating this industry, we would really greatly appreciate your financial support as well. Really, any amount counts. So here's part of our team. Thank you all so much for your help on this conference. It would not have happened without all of you. There is a lot of work that goes into this. We do really try to make these discussions highlighting the top challenges facing the industry and bringing in the experts to address those challenges. And that takes time and expertise. So thank you to this, and the team's so big we actually can't fit everybody on the stage. So this is part of our team right here. Everyone say hello. Camila, do we have more, or did we get everybody?
Yeah, almost everybody.
Oh, good. Okay, well, a huge thank you from the MII team to everybody who attended this conference. Please reach out. A reminder that you can watch the sessions. So they are recorded and will be available in the replay section. Enter the conference the way you got here, And you can access those recordings for up to 6 months after the conference. And then we are going to make them publicly available through our YouTube channel. You can actually watch, last year's conference on our YouTube channel right now. And again, reach out if there's anything we can do to help. So thank you to everybody.